I like trains. Now, I'm no train enthusiast, at least not in the sense where I can name different types of trains and I go to train shows on the regular, but I appreciate them as a concept. I think they're a convenient and efficient way of getting around, and once in a while I'll see a model train display and go, yeah, you know what, that's pretty cool. Trains definitely beat traveling by car, where you have to deal with traffic, navigation, other drivers, and the overwhelming sense of your own mortality knowing that if you make one wrong move behind the wheel, it's all over. But the train is a different beast, my friends. They're comfy, you can get up and walk around, you don't have to worry about sitting in traffic, there's a bathroom, and if you're on one of those long-distance ones, sometimes there's even a snack car that comes around. Trains make me feel safe. But interestingly enough, when train travel was new, the public had a very different perception of them. Trains were the future. They opened up the world of high-speed travel and would help propel society into the age of industrialization. But, as with any new technology, they were also associated with a general sense of anxiety. On one hand, you got train travel, but on the other hand, you also got train accidents, train crime, and even
train madness.
So join me, dear viewers, as we explore what it was like to take a journey on a 19th century passenger train and learn all about the terrifying world of Victorian train travel. The impact that the railway had on 19th century life really can't be overstated. The ability to move trade goods, supplies, resources, and people across land at unprecedented speeds was revolutionary. Prior to the train, most long-distance land travel was achieved through the stagecoach, which was able to carry people at an average speed of only 8 kilometers per hour. Once the first passenger rail lines opened, however, that speed would triple. One of the things that always fascinates me about the early days of train travel is imagining what it would be like for someone to get on a train for the first time. You've gone your whole life traveling by foot, by horse or carriage, and maybe a ship if you had to go somewhere far, only to climb into this giant metal contraption and speed across the land at a rate that no human had ever traveled before. I can only assume that it must have been terrifying, and for some people, it was. The first passengers aboard these vehicles compared them to a bullet, a metal object soaring through space at terrifying speeds. Others wondered how people were even able to ride trains at all, believing surely going that fast would kill the passengers, or at the very least cause medical problems. There were anxieties surrounding being able to breathe at high speeds, fears of brain damage. In general, apprehension surrounding train travel really stems from the fact that it was new. We were still figuring things out, both in terms of operating these new machines, and making them as comfortable and efficient as possible. And though the train would eventually become a regular part of everyday life, it took several decades for the passenger experience to refine itself. Early trains were separated by class, with the experience of ridership differing greatly between them. First and second class carriages were modeled after the closest comparable vehicle, the stagecoach, simply taking what was familiar for people and incorporating it into the train. For those riding third class, however, carriages were open, exposing passengers to the elements as well as ash and smoke from the train's engine. This was, as you might imagine, an incredibly uncomfortable experience, one that people often compared to being carted around like livestock. Early passenger trains also didn't include any type of shock absorption yet, so not only did you have to contend with the rain, wind, cold, and smoke, but you would be painfully jostled around the entire time. This even resulted in some cases where train journeys had to be extended by multiple hours, since the train couldn't travel at full speed without risking the safety of third-class passengers in poor weather. Conditions for those riding third class would eventually improve in 1844, with the passage of the Railway Regulation Act, which required that all carriages, including third class, be covered. Though this certainly made train travel more comfortable, these new carriages still provided the bare minimum, packing dozens of people into the same car with small windows and hard wooden benches for the duration of the journey. First and second class accommodations would also improve during this time, being outfitted with plush upholstered seating, and decorated as though they were a space in someone's home. Upper class passengers also had the luxury of carriages that were separated into individual compartments. These were locked from the outside to provide privacy, But it also resulted in the isolation of passengers, leaving them completely trapped inside until a worker opened the door again once the train stopped. Additional comforts and facilities wouldn't appear until around the 1870s. Heating and lighting, for example, would be absent for the majority of the century, with the only light aside from windows being a single oil lamp per compartment. Even more concerning is the absence of a bathroom. Proper facilities for longer journeys like a dining car, a place to sleep, and yes, bathrooms, wouldn't be available until trains were redesigned to include hallways and doors between the carriages, which allowed passengers to freely roam the train. But for many, the most harrowing part of train travel was not the lack of physical comfort, but rather the environment of the train itself. As we've discussed before on this channel, manners were a very important part of Victorian society. Knowing how to behave in any given situation was a way that people distinguished themselves as a part of respectable society. Different environments came with different social codes, and of course, your behavior might change depending on who you were interacting with and the context of that interaction. This was true both for upper-class individuals who had a social reputation on the line, as well as working-class people who struggled to separate themselves from the other, icky and gross type of working-class people. And of course, the emerging middle class were usually the ones that were playing the most complex games of 4D manners chess. But the train was new. It didn't have a predetermined set of rules for how to behave. It was a public space, but it was furnished like a private one. It was similar to a stagecoach where you might occasionally be riding with strangers, but unlike a stagecoach, the landscape was hurtling by, and the people in your compartment might be switched out every few stations. Getting to know who you were traveling with was no longer a necessity, and when people refused to socialize, that made things awkward. Now, this wasn't usually an issue in third-class carriages, where people were in large groups and the general atmosphere was more geared towards socialization. You never had to worry about an awkward silence settling over the space. But for second and first class passengers who were riding in private compartments, the train brought discomfort. In order to avoid the mortifying ordeal of interacting with strangers in public, train stations began selling reading materials so that upper-class passengers could have a socially acceptable way to ignore each other, much like how I pretend to be on my phone to avoid awkward eye contact today. It is important to note, however, that this was a uniquely European problem. American trains were designed differently, and included larger communal cars with seats that faced each other, which, much like the third-class carriage on the British lines, encouraged socialization. As for the British, however, riding a train meant being trapped in a confined space with a handful of people until you reached the station, unable to leave even during an emergency. And as train ridership increased throughout the mid-century, anxieties surrounding passenger safety grew as well. When any new technology is invented, it involves an ongoing process of trial and error. We have to test out different models, find out what works, what can be improved, and gradually learn whether or not this new invention comes with any consequences. Safety regulations have always been a part of this, though, unfortunately, even though we design new things with the intention of being safe, safety is often learned on the job, and the train was no exception to this. In the early days of train travel, a lot of accidents happened because people just didn't know to treat trains with the necessary amount of caution. Passengers would stand up while the train was moving, climbed onto the roof of their train car, stuck their heads and limbs out of open carriages, and some even tried to jump out while the vehicle was still in motion. Those who weren't on board also failed to understand that the tracks were dangerous. The only thing they could compare trains to were the other slow-moving vehicles they were familiar with, ones that were able to stop or quickly steer around anything in their path to avoid collision. But trains were traveling too fast to stop at a moment's notice. Both pedestrians and train operators alike misjudged how much time it would take to stop the train or avoid being hit. As train travel became more normalized, the amount of accidents that resulted from ignorance would eventually decline, but there were still plenty of larger, scarier accidents to take their place in the public consciousness. One had to worry about derailments, boiler explosions, collisions, and plenty of other accidents that resulted from mechanical failure or human error. Of course, horrifying accidents happened every day during the Industrial Revolution. People died in mining accidents and shipwrecks. They worked dangerous jobs operating factory machinery or exposing themselves to harmful chemicals. But train accidents were different. They haunted the general public in a way that others simply didn't. These were violent, they affected members of all social classes, and rather than happening out in the middle of the ocean or some far-off mining community, they could happen right in your town. The lack of control that passengers had when riding the train also exacerbated these fears. Locked inside your compartment, your fate was entirely left in the hands of the operators. Something could go wrong at any moment, and if it did, well, you might just be trapped in there. Newspapers at the time took to reporting train accidents with horrific detail, often exaggerating events and giving them far more coverage than they needed. This led to many developing a negative perception of rail travel, despite the fact that Victorian trains were generally safe and reliable, and there were plenty of other things that were far more deadly. In 1860, for example, data collected from the Board of Trade found that there were 68 train accidents in Great Britain, which resulted in 37 deaths and 515 injuries. Yet the year prior, the number of carriage accidents in London alone surpassed both of those figures, resulting in 70 deaths and 910 injuries. But due to the hysteria perpetuated by mass media, the train was labeled as a place of terror, somewhere where you could lose your life in an instant. And for some, train accidents weren't even the thing that concerned them the most, because, as many Victorian newspapers would have you believe, there was also a chance that you might be trapped on there with a lunatic. Crime was a part of everyday life in Victorian cities, and as people began using the train to migrate between them, it was only natural that crime would follow. Trains were a common home for pickpockets, muggers, card sharks, and occasionally even a full-scale robbery if the train you were on was also transporting valuable cargo. But for the general public, there was something far more terrifying than a few small-time criminals hiding out on the train. They were far more concerned with criminals who might be hiding in plain sight, ready to snap at a moment's notice due to a sudden onslaught of railway madness. What is railway madness? Well, according to Victorian doctors, the sounds and motion of a train could cause bouts of temporary insanity in seemingly normal people. Alleged cases of railway madness usually followed the same pattern. A perfectly sane person boards a train. Then, after a while, they become agitated and start exhibiting strange or violent behavior. Then, as soon as the train stops, they return to normal, before slipping back into insanity the moment it moves again. In one case of railway madness, a man accused a fellow passenger of theft before attempting to throw himself out the train window. The other passengers were able to pull him back into the safety of the carriage, but he then turned on them, attacking anyone he could reach until his fellow passengers were forced to subdue him by holding him down and tying him to his seat. Another incident reported involved a man who began laughing maniacally and grabbing at the window between his carriage and the next one over. When the train stopped and workers came to check on him, he seemed perfectly normal, only to begin his strange behavior again once the train left the station. This supposedly escalated until the man took out a pistol and began threatening to shoot the people watching him in the next carriage. Why did the train cause people to react like this? Well, both Victorian doctors and contemporary scholars have some theories. According to medical professionals at the time, the conditions of modern life after mass industrialization, especially within urban areas, was just too stressful for most people to handle. The jostling motion, high speeds, strange noises, and confined nature of the train supposedly contributed to this, thus resulting in a temporary lapse of sanity. Contemporary scholars suggest, however, that the fear around railway madness can largely be attributed to a moral panic. As you might imagine, local newspapers took to reporting cases of madness like wildfire, often exaggerating events and terrorizing the public by suggesting that secret madmen were hiding amongst their fellow train passengers. This was also contributed to by social concerns at the time surrounding degeneracy amongst the working classes, as well as growing attention on those suffering from mental illness, known at the time as madness. And you know what? I do understand why people might have been freaked out traveling on a train. It must have been terrifying after only using a horse and buggy your entire life. And the fact that you were literally locked into a confined space with random people, unable to escape or call for help for hours at a time, probably didn't help either. I'd probably have railway madness too if they locked me in a compartment and then told me there wouldn't be a bathroom available for the whole time. In fact, as concerns over railway madness progressed, there were many that began pointing out the flawed design of early trains. Not only did the isolated nature of train compartments exacerbate concerns about madmen, but it also made them the ideal location to commit crimes unseen, since the victims had nowhere to run to and no way to contact anyone working on the train or inhabiting the other compartments. Both of these things would unfortunately come to a head in horrifying fashion, with the murder of Chief Justice Poinsot in 1860 and English banker Thomas Briggs in 1864. These two incidents would spark demands to redesign train carriages to be safer for passengers, eventually resulting in the creation of cars with interior hallways, so that people were no longer confined to their compartments. As the passenger experience gradually improved and the train became a more normal part of everyday life, fears surrounding this new mode of transportation would also die down. Today, most people don't think twice before getting on a train, and they still remain arguably the most efficient way of transporting large groups of people. So give it up for trains, everybody! Their origins may be steeped in fear, but they've got your back. Now if only we could convince North America to start building more high-speed rail. Hey everyone, thank you for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.